Hello, this is a program called Searching for Answers. My name is Carolyn Thompson, and on my right is...
John Jones, La Sierra University.
John Brunt, the Azure Hills Church.
And John Pauline, Loma Linda University.
John Pauline, would you like to start out for us and tell us where to begin here in the book of Acts?
Well, thank you. I'd be delighted to do that. We have been taking a look, working our way through the book of Acts, and in our last session we were summarizing some of the things that happened up until now, particularly through chapter 13. We noticed how it describes first Peter and now Paul as he begins his missionary journeys, going from place to place and trying to share the gospel first in the synagogue and then often in Gentile contexts. Now we've come to chapter 14, and I'd like to invite you to take your Bible and join us in chapter 14, and I'll begin reading the first few verses. Let's read through verse 7. It tells the story of Iconium. Iconium is a small city that's sort of in the southern middle of the peninsula we call Turkey today. And back then it was Asia Minor and part of a number of Roman provinces that were in that part of the world. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. So it mentions here, as usual, Paul, when he gets to town, starts with the synagogue. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there, speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. There was a plot afoot among both Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, to mistreat them and stone them. But they found out about it, and they fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe, and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the gospel. So here we see in this text that Paul and Barnabas spent some time there, and they succeeded, you could say, in dividing the synagogue.
And ultimately the city.
And the city, that is an extended part here, isn't it? The Jews in the synagogue were divided between those who were impressed with the message and those who were not. The Gentiles in the synagogue were divided. And then eventually both of these had connections throughout the city that began to take sides. And in the process, Paul and Barnabas decided that leaving town was probably the wisest thing. What do you suppose they did before they left town?
Shook the dust off
the shoes. That's right.
That's a good point. Boy, what I was thinking, though, they probably took some time. I would imagine they identified, and Paul at a later point talks about the gifts of the Spirit.
Yes.
They identified people who had unique spiritual talents and trained them to handle the new believers and to keep the church moving forward until such a time as Paul or Barnabas could return.
That's right. And the presence of the Spirit is validated by the fact that there are miracles. They're called both signs and wonders. I don't know the distinction. In verse 3, chapter 14 of Acts, verse 3. So this is a powerful experience. There are miracles. Miracles belong to the cutting edge of the gospel. They belong to evangelism. That's their world, particularly. And this is all, I think that's part of why Jews and non-Jews both found some credibility in Paul and Barnabas. If it had just been these two characters, shambling in here, but the fact that they are raising people up who are crippled and so forth, that Paul and Barnabas may leave, but the Spirit doesn't, as you said, John. And so there is some provision for the carry forward, isn't there, of the gospel?
Did I hear you say, John, is this what you want our viewers to take away? that if we really wanted to see more miracles, we would do more spreading of the gospel? Is that? I was fascinated by that. I just want you to confirm that or clarify that how you wish.
Yes, I think many of us are a little too settled within the fold. You know, we're not out there, and I think I've always wondered why miracles seem to happen more in the mission field. Partly it may have to do with the mindset of the people, the situation of the culture, but I think it's also got to do with that sort of vanguard situation. That's where miracles find their home, it seems to me.
I think you're onto something. I do know that in one of the Gospels, maybe one of you can remember the text, but it is stated that Jesus could not do miracles in that place because of their unbelief.
It's John 4. John 2, actually. Yeah.
So that being the case, then that it seems that as people come to belief, that they're doing that because the presence of God, presence of the Spirit is there, and that spills over even into things that are maybe physically visible. And I think you have a point. I've seen that. I've had some experience in that regard.
I wonder why, with the miracles, and with some people believing both Jew and Gentile, why was their message so divisive? Why were the people who didn't accept it so worked up to oppose it? I mean, you could imagine that it might be that they would come with this message and some people accepted it and other people said, ho-hum, we don't see it that way. But it doesn't seem to be that kind of, it really seems to put a wedge here, and people either accept it or they are ready to stone these people.
Indeed.
It's a threat to the status quo. People need a certain stability. They need a certain security in life. It's a threat to the status quo. Just give you an example. Unconditional love. You'd think, man, if I lived by unconditional love, everybody would love me, right? They would have no reason not to. I love them, they love me. Not the way it works. Because the last thing most people want you to do is to love their enemy. And if you love their enemy, they will reconcile with that enemy to kill you. There's something weird about us. You're breaking up the status quo when you live by the teachings of Jesus, when you live by the gospel.
Let me give you a layman view of this sort of thing. Rather than making it so hard for some people to understand, I told my husband, I spent this afternoon studying this, and I said, you know, Ralph, it seems to me, as I read where Paul and Barnabas went from place to place, city to city, people accepted it, they were thrilled with the message, and the Jewish people would come and undermine what they said. I said, and here Jesus has just been crucified, and here they're bringing the good news, as my Bible. The good news says, the Good News Bible says it's the good news. Okay, so I looked and I thought that probably I saw a battle going on between good and evil, that Jesus was trying to get his disciples to spread the good news, and Satan and his angels were doing everything they could to thwart it. So by the time some of the people accepted it gladly, and then people, Jews or whatever, would come along, even the women who were in high social standing, they would undermine what the disciples had just told them. So to me, there's this battle going on between the good news of salvation and the people who didn't mean to demean it, but they did it.
Yeah.
I think you make a good point, Carol, and let's always keep in mind that there's a satanic component in all this. But I would also say, if Satan died tomorrow, would we notice? Or would most of us just go on our same self-centered way as before?
I've never thought of Satan dying because he's not going to die.
I'm just making a point. The point is that we don't need a lot of help to be selfish, to be bigoted, to
Well, that's
to
my
resist
point,
the gospel.
though. John, since creation, look what all the genes we're carrying.
Yeah.
How could we even attempt to be good?
Right.
Others turn out to be totally wicked, and others aren't bent that way. But I'm just saying that our genes have a lot to do with it. And when the Bible talks about having a new heart, the only thing that can bring that about is to fall in love with Jesus.
Yes, that's for sure. You were asking a moment ago, why was it that people in some cases were so stringent, even violent, in kicking back against the gospel? But of course we know that Paul himself kicked back against the gospel, didn't he?
Sure.
I think he was very clear-headed. He understood as a Pharisee the theological aberration, the theological threat or danger that was present in this notion of the divine becoming human. That was a barrier that the Gentile world, some people could think of being bridged. They had their own stories about that, some of them pretty sexy, but nonetheless, no Jew would ever open up to that possibility. The Messiah was not understood as someone who is divine. That was simply a human who was anointed. I think that the inner instinct, the deep resistance on the part of many Jewish people was based on that very clear-eyed, clear-headed perception, which we begin to see actually happening in this very chapter. A few verses later, when we get here we have people, saying, these men are gods.
Oh,
now,
yes.
that works for Gentiles. It sure doesn't work for Jews, does it?
No, even though there were lots of different ideas about Messiah,
Right.
none of them included the idea that the Messiah was divine.
Right. So I think the kickback was understandable from a human Judaic's perspective,
Okay, let's go to our map again, okay? And we're going to find out where Lystra was and Iconium, and I'm going to have my good friend John Jones point it out to you.
Oh, I'll be the hand model this evening.
Okay.
Is that it?
Yes.
And I knew I should have trimmed my nails.
Okay.
Let's see if we can get zoomed in
right
here.
there.
Yeah,
You
right.
see, now we want it
There
forward
we go.
so it isn't
Now you
shiny.
come a little left of center, actually, as we said a moment ago. You can see right up in there. You may have a label for the province, the whole area there as well, but you'll see Iconium, and then just south, Lystra and Derbe. And the story goes on that we're reading here in chapter 14. We're going to hit all three of those cities before we're done here.
Yes. All right. Who wants to read on?
I'll read on about Lystra,
Yes.
starting in verse 8 of chapter 14 of Acts.
Okay.
In Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet and had never walked, for he had been crippled from birth. He listened to Paul as he was speaking, and Paul, looking at him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And the man sprang up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to be with us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garland to the gates. He and the crowds wanted to offer sacrifice. When the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We are mortals just like you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations he allowed all the nations to follow in their own ways. Yet he has not left himself without a witness in doing good, giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, and filling you with food and your hearts with joy. Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them.
Can you believe that? Can you believe what do you mean, Zeus and Hermes? And by the way, our temple to Zeus is right out here. And we're bringing you oxen and garlands around their neck, and we're going to sacrifice them because you're gods. Can you imagine?
And imagine how Paul and Barnabas,
when the whole crowd is all worked up, how are you going to calm them down?
I can think of a few televangelists, I will not mention names, who might have been tempted to just go with that for a little while.
Well, you know, this is an interesting thing. In a way, it's the dilemma that God faces every time he tries to talk to us. On the one hand, he needs to meet us where we are. He needs to touch us. If he comes out over here and we're over here, we won't even see him. So he comes to us in a form that we can understand. But the moment that happens, we invest what we learned from him in this whole universe of ideas that we've brought with us and immediately get it wrong. And so these people, they had this whole religion, ancient, seems like a pretty typical ancient Greek religion. And you'll find that in various places in Greece today, archaeologically and so on. When God comes to them, they immediately invest that, they reinterpret it in terms of their world. And breaking through a worldview is a very difficult thing.
It is.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, John, have you got an example in mind of people that are in countries, say, of Africa or Nepal or some of these places I've been to, where their picture of God is not the picture that we have, and yet God is working with them, as you said. So what do you say, how does God meet them and tell them who he really is?
Well, I'd love to give a New Testament example, which I think can help us. In the first chapter of the Gospel of John, and it would be fun if we could study that book sometime soon. But in the first chapter of the Gospel of John, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now, you go through the Gospel, you don't find that. That title is not given to Jesus. It's only here at the beginning. And it appears that the gospel perhaps was first written for Jews, but when it went out to the Gentiles, there were some things that were added. This is pretty widely suspected, at least by the scholarly community. And this word, word, in the Greek is logos. Now here's the interesting point.
What does logos mean?
Logos means word.
Okay, in the beginning
in the Old Testament, logos is only something spoken. It's never a person. But here it's a person. And in the Greek world, Plato, Aristotle, etc., the idea was that God was so great that even in creation he never touched the earth. He used an intermediary, a second God, a mediator that he called the Logos. So Plato and others labeled this Logos being in between God and the earth. And to the Gentile, John wants to get to them. He doesn't say, "I bring you the Messiah."
No.
Who's that? "I bring you the Son of Man." You know, who's that? No, he says, this Logos.
Oh, beautiful.
Logos, whom you know, has a lot of similarities to the role that Jesus played in connecting us with God, you see. So there you see very clearly, and I give you about a half a dozen examples just in the New Testament of where God, coming to people, uses their language, uses their background. But again, the problem with that is that when you do that, there's always the danger they will invest that language with too much of their background and then get it all mixed up. And sometimes people call that syncretism.
Now we know.
That's an important thing to know. It's always the gospel. It never comes in a vacuum, does it? Never.
Any missionary.
It's always contextual.
Any missionary has to deal with that. That's because right. you're going into a new place. You mentioned Africa, Nepal, and you're looking for a context in which the gospel can make sense. But when you bring the gospel in that context, I'm in danger of telling a bunch of stories, so I'll stop.
That's all right.
But when you bring the gospel in that kind of context, people can take it in the wrong direction. That's why what's so hard for us to see here in the West is that we do the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
But it's our Western syncretism that's so comfortable to us, we don't even see it. It's those people over there.
Now say it in
those
plainer
delighted-
language. You got ahead of me there.
Well, we ourselves, for example, all right, you want to go with this? Let's go with this.
Sure.
All right, where was the New Testament, the events of the New Testament, where did they take place? Largely in the Middle East.
That's right.
Who were the people that got it started? Largely Jews. It was a Middle Eastern religion.
Yes.
But Christianity morphed into Europe. And it became dominated by a European philosophical background, the Greek, the Roman background. And that inevitably altered Christian faith. Not all of it was bad. It was a contextualizing of this Middle Eastern faith into a European context. But in that context, this European philosophical world became so natural to us, and I think we're all Europeans here, became so natural to us that it seemed like that's the right way to read the Bible. And when you take up the original languages and so on, when you get into that original world, you realize we've twisted a lot of the Bible without even realizing it because of the world through which we read it. So it's a challenge for us today, that this is the Word of God, and yet we tend to read into it what we want to see there. And what we need to do is let the words of it come out to us. Go ahead.
I think an example of that for us as Americans would be our whole emphasis on individualism. That as Americans, you know, the autonomous individual
Talk in plainer language. We as
the single
people,
human being
Yes.
who makes decisions and before God on their own, by themselves.
I am the master of my
Not
fate.
my mother, not my father, but it's me, O Lord.
Yeah.
The New Testament is much more communal than
Group-oriented.
I don't think Paul could have
Group-oriented.
ever
Community.
understood
Yeah.
Family.
the person in my class the other day who said, I don't see any need for a church. I just have my personal relationship with God, and I like to listen to Him and go up to the mountains and feel His presence, but I don't see any need
there's a lot of
for
people
a
feel like
church.
that.
Yeah,
John.
there are. But I think Paul would have had a very hard time
Yes.
Yeah.
understanding that whole
That's well
notion.
put.
For him, the body of Christ was a community. But we read those texts very individualistically because our culture is so individualistic. And if you don't believe me, just go right out here to the San Bernardino Freeway, which is a stone's throw from where we are right now. And there are 6 lanes, and one of them is a carpool lane, and 5 of them are not. And you will notice that there's lots of space in the one carpool lane. All you have to do to be a carpool is have 2 people in the car. It's not a real
Or a dummy with a hat
difficult-
on in the front seat.
But the 5 lanes of people with just one person in the car are sitting still during rush hour because we are very individualistic.
So we are.
All right, John Jones, tell me what they just said. For somebody out there in the middle America, or even watching us by television or by satellite someplace else, what did they just tell us?
That we've all been conditioned by watching too many Westerns. The ideal of the rugged individualist who, if need be, comes striding or riding into town with a 6-shooter on his hip and straightens everything out and then rides back off into the sunset again.
That has nothing to do with God.
It has everything to do with our conception of how God deals with us.
Okay.
Yeah.
right.
And so, we can expatiate, even prevaricate on this. If you
A good example is How do people get married in our country here?
Yeah.
They get married because one person falls in love with another person. That was never true in biblical times.
No.
Biblical times, a
It's
family got
prearranged.
together with another family and said, we'd like to have, to increase our relationships here. Do you have a daughter over here that would match up with our son? And can this help unify our
That's still
society?
going on.
In many places.
Yes.
But those are places, more Eastern places, not those influenced by
And
the
when we
European
ask our
philosophy.
college students how they feel about that notion, it is not going on.
Yeah.
They'll go get the 8.5-minute special at our little chapel by the roadside in Vegas before they'll yield to that kind of thing.
But we'd also have to say that the New Testament does critique too much of a communalism, because the New Testament does challenge people to make individual decisions. Paul calls people to become Christians even if their spouse doesn't, for instance, where Plutarch, the Greek philosopher, roughly the same time, tells women, be whatever religion your husband is, and don't rock the boat of the family.
So here we are. They're gods.
Yeah.
And they've even figured out which. Probably Barnabas was better. Paul, there's every reason to believe, was a scrawny old character. But by contrast, almost anyone, even Barnabas, would have been better looking, so he's Zeus. But Paul has a tongue in his mouth, and Hermes, or Mercury, as he was known, is the communicator guy, And so flowers by telegraph, Mercury is the symbol of communication, and so they had it figured out. But of course, on the other hand, we've seen a couple chapters earlier that Herod let people call him God, and it didn't work out very well.
That's right.
Yes, God took a dim view of that almost immediately. So you see, there's stories in the Bible that help us stay on the right path, to be encouraged, don't be discouraged. Remember, Jesus is coming soon. You can tell that's what's going on in the world. So stay faithful. And until next time, this is Carolyn Thompson.